Okay, now I'm going to make good on my promise to give you guys a little bit of a talk about the nervous system and neurons, and specifically, you guys are steering me toward one particular topic in that giant field of study, which is kind of a big topic in and of itself, but it's all about neuron signaling, how neurons signal and talk to each other, and this concept is sort of central to what they do. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to talk about two main ways that the cells do that, and I'm going to try to do it in a slow, methodical way where I, bring in other kind of core ideas of science and just, general thinking about the problem instead of going too crazy on specifics. But the two big types of signaling that we can lump um, neurons into that they do is chemical signaling, and that's going to be the topic for today. And then there's electrical signaling, which shall be probably a part two of this. So we're going to, and there's similarities and differences. We'll talk about that as we go, but chemical signaling will be the first one that we do. So this main topic is going to be chemical signaling in neurons. And let me just start by saying that I'm using the slide that Maya left off on in our last little neuroscience lecture, but that neurons or brain cells are complex. So here's like a sketch of one, which is might have even be sketched, from a real section. I think it was sketched from a real section that was filled with some kind of dye or color that, which they can do and with fancy stains and then microscopy, and they can reconstruct these things. So here's like the cell. This part here is the cell body, where it has the nucleus and everything. But these aren't just like like when you're in basic class, you're being introduced to cells, they just show like a basic like sac with a nucleus in the middle, and these other things in there that are organelles and parts and pieces inside. I'm going to get to that. But the typical like circular type of structure or oval or egg-shaped structure that they show you with a bunch of things packed in is really, it's almost so simple. It gives you almost like not a good picture or a wrong picture of what they're really like, and what and what any typical cell is really like in terms of its complexity. But real neurons are even just insofar as being complex. They're more complex maybe than normal cells. Normal cells are super complex. Neurons are probably another level of complexity, more complex than even a normal cell. I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that in a minute. But like in this particular structure, you got a cell body, and then you get this giant like tree structure. And this tree, again, these are terms that you've heard of, but this is like a dendritic tree or dendrites. Dendritic tree. And what this cell would be doing is it would be getting information. All these other wires would be coming in from all over the nervous system and making contacts, inside this tree. And we're gonna see and learn about what those contacts are looking like and what they're doing. But those contacts are going to be involved in chemical signaling. Obviously, you've got some cells that are wanting to communicate with this cell, and they're going to come in and do most of that communication, although not all of it. There's exceptions to every rule, but most of the connections do come into a dendritic tree, and then all those signals sort of have to get sorted out and figured out. There's like crazy computations that are happening in a tree. This, like a given neuron may even have like 1,000 different cells coming in to talk to it and making connections all over this dendritic tree. And then there's a cell body, and the information coming in we'll learn, toward the end, but everything is going to get sort of converted into like electrical signals. And the cell's going to have to make a choice whether to send a pulse of electricity down this wire. And this wire is an axon. So, you get crazy activities and computations that are happening up here. But in the end, all that can happen is, a decision can be made at this beginning of this axon about whether or not to send an electrical signal down, and we could talk more about that signal in that second part, what that looks like and how you can vary it, and how that's generated and all sorts of stuff. But real neurons are super complex. They have like sections that are doing of even within one individual cell that are doing different properties. The cell body is making all the parts and pieces, and the DNA is in there, and the protein making machinery is in there, as well as in dendrites and other places too. Proteins are getting made, but a lot of the organelles are getting made here and being shipped out and transported to dendritic trees, and just crazy complicated. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we kind of get to different parts of this lecture and the next. But a neuron is just a cell. And again, this is that generic representation of a cell, but a cell is just like any cell has all sorts of various parts and pieces. And in that sense, neurons aren't any different. It's just another type of a cell. And they have the same parts and pieces that other cells have, like nucleus and smooth endoplasmic reticulum and rough endoplasmic reticulum and ribosomes. And all these things are doing different things for a cell. And in high school and in college, you start to learn about what these different organelles or parts of a cell are doing for a cell. And in a way, that's usually taught by just memorizing a list of what the organelles do. Like, you will have to memorize that ribosomes are involved in protein synthesis. And you learn about how they do that, and you would learn that mitochondria are involved in energy, and you'll learn, and then in other classes you might learn about how they do that. But they never really, a lot of times in these lectures about like what, where they just get right into it and start giving you a laundry list of organelles and their functions, they never really just step back and ask, like, what are the basic things, like just asking this question, what do cells in general, and since a neuron is a cell, it's a perfect question to start this lecture, especially since I want to start from basic principles. But what do cells need to do? Okay, so obviously, and these organelles are going to be central to, they're going to be involved in all the things that a cells need to do. But like, just in general, you've got this bag, and it's all protected by the plasma membrane. We're going to definitely be talking about that because today's topic is really involving this coating, or the fatty layer that is completely surrounding and encaging the cell and keeping it protected. We'll talk more about that. But what do they need to? But what is happening inside there that cells need to do? Well, they need to make molecules, because obviously there's a lot of machinery here, and most of these things are, and I'm just going to write this because it's so important. But most of the machinery, the working parts and pieces of all cells, are proteins. They're protein machines, and the organelles themselves are basically mostly made of proteins and some other macromolecules, but the machinery, the working parts and pieces, are usually protein machines, and protein is just a macromolecule that obviously, if your cells are going to be making these machines, they have to be made and synthesized. And just to cut to the chase, in the DNA, which is inside the nucleus, it has the job of essentially creating a code for all the proteins, for all the things that the cells need to make it function. That's why it's like the master molecule. It's the blueprint for essentially what proteins the cell wants to make and when, and we'll get into that too a little bit later in this lecture. But the cells need to make molecules, they need to break molecules, and all of this making and breaking molecules, that is the same thing as chemical reactions. So, like, if you've got a bunch of atoms stuck together to form molecules, that's what molecules are. You've got atoms stuck together, and you've got some reactants here, and you want to form something else from it, or turn it into something else. So you've got reactants and products. The only way you can do that is to start taking atoms off of this thing or putting atoms on, but you've got to make and break bonds. And chemical reactions are all about taking some starting molecules and turning them into other things, and the starting materials are reactants, the ending materials are products. But in the end, you're basically taking a bunch of starting materials and you're pulling a bunch of atoms off and rearranging them into other molecules. That's what a chemical reaction is all about. So all cells have to do chemical reactions, and they have to control that chemistry. They have to have tight control of that chemistry. That's one of the reasons why this plasma membrane, it keeps everything outside out, and it really just kind of keeps that internal milieu like well controlled, because you need to control everything. One of the main things that need to be tightly controlled is all the chemistry going on inside. That's a big part of what cells need to do. Cells need to divide and make daughter cells. Again, you're having to make new molecules to do that. You're having to copy DNA to get the instructions into both cells. So everything always does come down to chemistry, and biology is no exception. But all the things that the cells do also come down to chemistry. And the thing we're going to talk about today is all these cells need to be able to sense and respond, because this cell is going to be in a body with literally 50 trillion other cells, and it needs to kind of be able to do its job. There's different kinds of cells and there's specialists, so it needs to know. It needs to be able to sense what's going on in its environment and then do what it needs to do its job to help the whole organism. So a big part of what cells need to do, and we're going to talk about, and that's the topic mostly of today, is the sense and respond. And interestingly enough, a neuron is a brain cell, and we usually say that this is the job of the whole brain. But I'm telling you now that in the hierarchy of things, even the individual cells of a brain, and there's 100 billion brain cells in your brain, even those individual cellular units have the ability to sense and respond. And we'll talk about that too. But again, for a brain cell to sense and respond, we got to talk about that cell membrane. And the cell membrane is what they're calling plasma membrane here. It's the covering on the outside whose purpose is to really be able to keep everything inside contained and controlled. It's really about homeostasis. And that's great. And you can form like this fortress inside the cell so that you can control everything going on inside. But that fortress that you make is also a prison, because now if nothing can get across this plasma membrane, and that's one of its jobs, because you want to keep the inside constant and just let it do what it needs to do and keep all the bad things out. If you want to do that job, you're making a fortress, but it's also a prison, because if this cell is going to need to know what's going on, in its body, it needs to be able to have some of that information find its way inside. And we're going to talk about how that happens. That's a big part of signaling in neurons, is how information, things happening on the outside or in another cell, can get into and inform a neighboring cell or a cell that's far away. So we're going to talk about that cell membrane. So this is the chemistry of the cell membrane. It's what's called a bilayer. And just like this picture is showing you, oil and water, they do not mix. So if you do want to make a fortress, and mostly cells are water, it's water and things are pretty much dissolved in that water, and you want to make a barrier so that things can't get in and out, oils or fats are the best way to do it, because they kind of stick together. The oil or fat molecules stick to each other, and they don't let the water molecules go in. It really does provide a barrier, and that's why they say oils and waters don't mix. And one of the reasons that they do also comes straight back to chemistry, where if you see like what the cell membrane looks like, it's this bilayer sheet where you get these like little units that have like a little circle with two legs sticking off it. I'm just drawing one of them. And these legs are fatty. And they contain a big chains that are just, that part of the molecule is just carbons and hydrogens sticking off. And they pretty much, they are not the kind of atoms or atomic arrangements that like to interact with water. And again, that's very well known, and I would be able to describe that pretty easily about why that is and how that works, but that gets into more basic chemistry. But these guys, these fatty parts don't like to let water cross through them. If you're a water molecule, an H2O, you're not going to get through that barrier. And you'll see that water has something as a part of its little molecule that is not here in these guys, in these atoms, is these oxygen atoms. So these oxygen atoms are sort of like charged. They have like a lot of negative charge areas around them, but these carbon and hydrogens don't. But if you look at this part of the molecule, of this fat molecule, that's what's in this little head region here. You do see oxygens and nitrogens and things that also have charged particles kind of, distributed around them. So there's ways for water molecules to interact with what's called this head group on these fat molecules. So all of these can interact with water, and they're like legs, which are basically don't like to interact with water, are all like stuck together. So this is like the fatty layer in here. This is all fatty. And then these circular head groups, they can interact with water. So you form the cell membrane is like a sheet. So this might be the outside of the cell, and this would be the inside of a cell. And it's a barrier. Nothing can get in or out because those are dissolved in water, and they're never going to get through this middle area here, which is all fatty. So you do this like legs to leg arrangement, where you have the water loving part, the fatty part, and then the other part of the cell membrane is you just have another molecule that's oriented the opposite way, and you just string that together into what's called a bilayer. And the entire cell membrane, this entire sheet, the coating of the entire cell, is what's called this bilayer. So it's got the two layers, layer 1 and layer 2, that basically put a fatty barrier between the outside and the inside of a cell. Again, that's great. You've got a protective fortress now inside the cell where you can keep things constant and keep your homeostasis. But how do you know what's going on outside of that bilayer? That's the trick, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So the answer is the layer, the real. So this is a cell membrane layer, but in cells, the way they do it, they have to. If this was the beginning and end of it, there would be no way for the cell to know what's going on the outside. There would be no way to communicate information to the inside of the cell. So real cells put protein machines across. Remember, everything's protein machines that the cells really, they're functional. Most of their functionality is really done by proteins and protein machines. So they insert protein machines through the bilayer, threaded through. So now they have a way for information on the outside to find its way to get in. And I'm just going to write information. And of course, again, it's going to come back to molecules. That'll be some molecule out here that the cell's going to want to know about. That's going to be meaningful to the cell, where information can go in and cause some cellular change. And now we have a way to do it. So in this bilayer here, you've got proteins that are communicating the outside to the inside of a cell, and those are going to be critical for both chemical signaling, which we're going to talk about today, and electrical signaling in neurons. I should also say that the two types of signaling, the chemical and the electrical, which is ways for cells to signal, get information from outside to in, that's not unique to neurons. Not all cells, but other cells do chemical and electrical signaling. So neurons don't, it's crazy, but neurons don't do anything that's completely unique. Like, they have really hardcore specializations, but they, where they make like a thin wire axon and, and send that like a long distance. But, the axon is just, a little tube made of a lipid bilayer, and, you've got cytoplasm inside. It's just like a long cellular extension. It's not like a wire. It's just made of cell parts, and it's got, it doesn't do anything really that's not seen in any other cell. There are other cells that do electrical signaling, and every cell in your body does some form or others, multiple types of chemical signaling. So here's where we're at. We've got the problem of, we need to be able to sense and respond, like sense what's going on outside. Brain cells need to do that. But again, this is general. All cells have this same problem. Brain cells are just masters at it. And now it's a problem of the lipid bilayer. It's been circumvented by putting protein machines through that bilayer. And we're going to talk about what those protein machines are doing and how they work. But just to tie things together now, just to give you come back to the scale of how everything's working, because this is a giant molecular blowup of the molecules, of these macromolecules that are making up the plasma membrane. This is like one protein that's threaded through. You could not see this with a light microscope, or you'd need crazy powerful electron microscopes to even begin to appreciate things at this scale. So let's just come back and see where we're at. So remember, this dendritic tree, this is a giant cell that you would be able to see with a light microscope, but not with your eye, but with a light microscope. And you might have 10,000 different connections all over this dendritic tree coming in from other neurons, all over the place, just from who knows where in the brain. So 10,000 connections. This blow up here is just one of those connections. This is one axon coming in somewhere in this crazy dendritic tree, and it's coming up and making this connection, and we're going to talk about that. This little bilayer here, all this thing which I showed in the other cell with these proteins that are threaded through the membrane, that is now what would be represented by this little piece right here. So if that makes sense. So this membrane here would be how this, so this is one cell coming in to talk to another cell, which is going to all be this stuff in here. Everything in here is going to be the cell of interest, the brain cell of interest. And it needs to find out that this cell is trying to communicate with it. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that's done. So you've got these proteins here that I've already hinted that they have to do that job, and I'm going to talk about how that works with regard to chemical signaling first, and then we'll talk about electrical signaling in another lecture. So I'm going to come and I'm just going to talk about this cell coming in. So we've got cell number one, trying to communicate with all of this stuff. So here's a space. That's the synapse. So there's a space between the cells, between the two nerve cells. The space between the nerve cells is the synapse. And then, so right here, all this stuff here is the synapse. It's a space. And then here's the cell membrane. Right here. This is the cell membrane, the lipid bilayer of, I'm just going to call it neuron number 2. And all this here is neuron number 2. All this space, so we would just be seeing the tiniest piece. If this was the whole neuron, it would obviously like come out and just fill the room. These connections are tiny. These synapses are tiny, and you can't even see them with light microscopes. You do need an electron microscope to see like these individual connections. So we're really getting microscopic here. Okay, and so I'm going to talk about one way to signal now through these receptors. So we've got a protein here, and I'm just going to say this is our protein right here, this guy here. So a lot of times we talk about receptors because they're receiving something. What are they receiving? Well, they're receiving molecules or information. Molecules, chemicals. Sometimes those are sometimes called signals, chemical signals. and that's just these are all forms of information. So again, when you see these big topics, it's really important to kind of be clear about, like when people are saying an information is passed from one cell to another, to really not have that be abstract, to realize that the currency of all these things is in the chemistry and in the molecules that these cells use and make, and and there's it ends up being not so mysterious. So neuron A is able to pack like little chemicals inside little vesicles, and they can spit these things out when a signal comes down the cell. And we'll learn about that later. I'll tell you about that later. But let's just say the signal comes down, and that causes these molecules to be spit out. And you can see that here. All these like little things that are here in this synapse are showing you that these molecules from cell number 1 has been spit out. And receptors are receiving, they're receptors because they're receiving that information. That means they have to be able to recognize, and by binding to or sticking to these molecules. So a lot of times receptors will have little like regions that can kind of recognize molecules that can fit into them and stick. So this might be a receptor, and this might be the another molecule that, or in this case we might call these neurotransmitters. But neurotransmitters are molecules that have to engage receptors. These are molecules that are being stored in brain cell 1, and neurotransmitters are just the chemicals that get spit out, and then there have to be receptors for those molecules on neuron number 2. Okay, so this receptor is gonna have like a docking site for this molecule, and the receptor has to do something. And remember, I was telling you that these receptors, all the real working parts of a cell, are protein machines. So this receptor is a protein machine that when it gets bound by its molecule, these protein machines, these molecules are flexible, they can bend, and the bonds between them can twist and do all sorts of things, so they can change their structure. They're hooked together, but it's like building blocks that are hooked together by flexible components, where you can twist and turn things so that maybe that when this thing sticks, it induces like conformational changes all in here, like the shape of that molecule, so that now it might look a little bit different when it's in the state that's bound by a neurotransmitter. So now you have your neurotransmitter and receptor bound, and now the receptor has changed its state. That happens on the inside. So if I put the little the foot sticking out of this receptor because it's now hearing the neurotransmitter, that change in state is again just chemistry, but already you can see the basics of sensing and responding. We're getting communication from things that were outside. The synapse is outside the cell. We are now getting the basics of getting communication from things happening outside, because this is outside, but this foot is inside the cell. Inside the cell, because that the protein spans the plasma membrane. It spans from the outside to the inside, and that's where the magic happens. A lot of the magic is happening in the receptors. And I was going to end this lecture by talking about now what that little foot kicking out, what these little changes in the conformation tend to trigger to really let the cells say, all right, now this receptor is bound, but big deal, that's not much of a change in the second cell. This change, this little foot sticking out, that has to be communicated in a big way. That has to be communicated in a big way to the inside of the cell to be meaningful, to really lead to a change in what that cell's going to do, or to lead to a response in what neuron number 2 is going to do now that neuron number 1 tried to talk to it. So one of the things that happens is, and again, you need to, in other words, you need to modify the machinery inside neuron number 2, and that's where kinases come into play. Remember I said that so much of what the cells are doing comes down to chemistry and controlling the chemistry? Well, kinases control chemical reactions inside the cell. That's what they do. So this little foot coming out, the start of the big way for the response is the receptor. The receptor, I'm just calling it the foot, or the conformational change that happened in the receptor, activates kinases. And now these kinases are going to now do a whole bunch of chemical reactions that start leading to big changes in the cellular machinery. And that's going to, if you can do that, you can start to change the state of that second cell in response to a little signal. So you get this amplification. By using biochemistry, you get an amplification. You can get these little neurotransmitters causing like these feet to come out in these little receptors, and now these little receptors can activate like a whole bunch of kinases inside, and then they start doing all sorts of gangbuster chemical reactions where you start to get big changes inside of a cell, and changes that are amplified, so you can amplify signals and start causing real responses in that second cell to things happening outside. I'm going to talk more about what those responses look like, and they actually end up making sense, like the kind of chemical reactions that happen when I give another lecture telling you like the kind of chemical reaction that this cell would like to do to make a meaningful change. I will tell you that in the next lecture, and it will start to make more sense. But right now, the big picture is to start to understand, just in terms of chemical signaling, of how you can get a chemical signal that's a tiny little molecule outside to lead to a big deal in a responding cell. And if you understand that through this lecture, that's everything you'll need to start to learn the specifics about, what the details are and the kind of specific changes that happen and how it makes sense. And then you're really starting to understand chemical signaling. And after we do that, then we're going to talk about a whole nother type of signaling, which is electrical signaling. And we'll build this idea of you're learning about how cells communicate. Neurons are the pinnacle of like cell-cell communication. They start doing it so well, and that magic emergent properties started happening as a result of the crazy levels of communication that happen. But just as a start, just to get the fundamentals under our belts, I hope that this lecture helps.